Her tiny hands were shaking as she tugged at the stranger's sleeve. Tears streaked down her face, her voice breaking with every word. "They hurt my mama. She's dying." The room fell silent. Glasses clinked to a stop. Every eye turned. But the man she had chosen to beg was no ordinary stranger. He was the most feared mafia boss in the city. And what he did next, no one in that room would ever forget. What would you do if you were that child, desperate and alone, with nowhere else to turn? Would you have the courage to walk into a room full of dangerous strangers and beg for your life? Before we find out what happens next, do me a favor. Hit that like button right now, subscribe to this channel, and share this video with someone who needs to hear a story about hope in dark places. Your support helps us bring more of these incredible true stories to light. Now, let's get into it. It's a cold Tuesday evening in downtown Chicago, 1987. The Golden Palm restaurant buzzed with the usual crowd of well-dressed men conducting business over expensive wine and hushed conversations. This wasn't just any restaurant. This was Han Do-sung's domain. Every waiter knew to keep their ears closed and their mouths shut. Every patron understood the unspoken rules. You minded your own business, you paid your respects, and you never, ever caused a scene. Han Do-sung sat at his usual corner table, a mountain of a man whose very presence commanded respect and fear in equal measure. At 53, he had built an empire that stretched across 3 states. His dark eyes missed nothing. His word was law. And tonight, like every Tuesday for the past 15 years, he was conducting the weekly meeting with his lieutenants. The conversation flowed in low, measured tones. Numbers were discussed, territories were divided, problems were addressed with surgical precision. This was how Han Do-sung operated. Methodical, calculated, without emotion clouding judgment. He had survived in this business longer than most because he understood one fundamental truth. Sentiment was weakness, and weakness got you killed. The scar that ran along his jawline was a reminder of the one time he'd let his guard down, the one time he'd trusted when he should have been suspicious. That mistake had cost him dearly, and he'd vowed never to let emotion rule his decisions again. But then something happened that would shatter the carefully constructed walls Han Do-sung had built around his heart. The restaurant's heavy oak door burst open with such force that it slammed against the wall. Every head turned. Conversations died mid-sentence. The maitre d' rushed forward, his face pale with panic. But before he could intercept the intruder, everyone saw what had caused the commotion. A little girl, no more than 7 years old, stood trembling in the doorway. Her clothes were torn and dirty. Blood stained her small white dress. Her dark hair hung in tangled knots around a face streaked with tears and grime. She looked like she had run through hell itself to get here. The child's breathing came in ragged gasps, her small chest heaving with exhaustion and terror. The child's eyes swept the room desperately, searching for something, someone, anyone who might help her. The restaurant's patrons stared back in stunned silence. Some looked away, uncomfortable with the intrusion. Others whispered among themselves, annoyed that their evening had been disrupted by what they assumed was some street orphan looking for handouts. One man in a gray suit made a dismissive gesture toward the door, as if the child were nothing more than an inconvenient interruption to his meal. But the little girl wasn't looking for money. She was looking for salvation. Her gaze landed on Han Do-sung's table, and something in those innocent brown eyes recognized power when she saw it. Maybe it was the way the other men deferred to him. Maybe it was the expensive suit or the gold watch that caught the light. Or maybe, just maybe, it was something deeper. A child's instinct recognizing the one person in that room who could actually do something. Without hesitation, she ran straight toward him. The room held its collective breath. Han Do-sung's bodyguards tensed, hands moving instinctively toward their jackets. This was unprecedented. No one approached Han Do-sung uninvited, especially not like this. The head of security, A broad-shouldered man named Tony Russo moved to intercept the child, but something in Han Do-sung's expression made him pause. But before anyone could react, the little girl reached Han Do-sung's table and grabbed his sleeve with both hands. Her tiny fingers clutched the expensive fabric as if it were a lifeline, and then she spoke those words that would echo in Han Do-sung's mind for the rest of his life. "They hurt my mama. She's dying." The silence that followed was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop in that restaurant. Every eye was on Han Do-seung, waiting to see how the notorious crime boss would handle this unprecedented situation. His reputation was built on being untouchable, unfeeling, a man who showed mercy to no one. There were stories about Han Do-seung that circulated through the city's underworld like ghost stories. Stories about men who had crossed him and simply disappeared. Stories about businesses that refused to cooperate and found themselves burning to the ground. Stories about a heart so cold that even winter itself seemed warm in comparison. Han Do-seung looked down at the child clinging to his arm. Her face was turned up toward his, those brown eyes wide with desperation and hope. In that moment, something shifted in the hardened criminal's chest, something he hadn't felt in decades. It was like a crack forming in ice that had been frozen solid for 30 years, a hairline fracture that threatened to spread and shatter everything. You see, Han Do-seung hadn't always been the cold, calculating crime boss that Chicago feared. Once upon a time, he had been a different man, a man who understood what it meant to lose everything that mattered. 30 years earlier, Han Do-seung had been married to a woman named Maria. She was the light of his world, the only person who could make him laugh, who could soften the edges that life had sharpened. They had dreams of starting a family, of building something beautiful together despite the ugly world Han Do-seung operated in. Maria had this way of looking at him that made him feel like he could be more than what he was, like the blood on his hands could be washed clean if he just tried hard enough. But those dreams were shattered one night when a rival family decided to send Han Do-seung a message. They didn't come for him directly. That would have been too easy, too expected. Instead, they went after the one thing they knew would destroy him more completely than any bullet or bomb ever could. They went after Maria. Han Do-seung came home that night to find his world torn apart, his wife, his future, his heart. All of it gone in an instant. The investigation went nowhere. The police asked questions they already knew they'd never get answers to. And Han Do-seung learned the hardest lesson of his life. In his world, love was a liability that could be exploited by anyone ruthless enough to target it. From that night forward, Han Do-seung built walls around his heart that no one could penetrate. He became ruthless because ruthlessness was survival. He became feared because fear was respect. And he became alone because alone meant no one else could be used against him. For 3 decades, those walls had held firm. No amount of pleading, threatening, or bribing had ever made Han Do-seung show mercy when mercy wasn't profitable. He had ordered hits on men who begged for their lives. He had foreclosed on businesses while owners wept at his feet. He had sent fathers to prison while their children cried in courtrooms. Each time, he had felt nothing. Each time, he had reminded himself that feeling nothing was what kept him alive. But now, looking down at this little girl who reminded him so painfully of the children he and Maria had dreamed of having, those walls began to crack. The child's grip tightened on his sleeve. Her voice came out in broken sobs as she tried to explain what had happened. Through her tears, Han Do-seung began to piece together a story that made his blood run cold. The little girl's name was Kim Na-na. Her mother, Hye-jin, worked at a small flower shop on the south side of the city. They lived in a tiny apartment above the shop, just the two of them trying to make an honest living in a neighborhood where honest livings were hard to come by. Nana described how her mother would wake up before dawn to arrange fresh flowers, how she would hum while she worked, how she always made sure Nana had breakfast before school, even when there wasn't enough money for her own lunch. But their neighborhood was also territory disputed by 2 rival gangs, both of whom demanded protection money from local businesses. Hyejin had been caught in the middle, unable to pay both sides, unwilling to choose between them. And tonight, that impossible situation had finally exploded into violence. Nana's words came out in a rush, punctuated by hiccups and sobs. She described how the men had come to the shop after closing time, how they had demanded money her mother didn't have, how the situation had escalated when Hyejin tried to protect the little bit of cash they needed for rent and groceries. And then, Nana described something that made even Han Do-sung's hardened associates shift uncomfortably in their seats. The men had beaten her mother unconscious and left her bleeding on the floor of the flower shop. Nana had hidden behind the counter, watching in terror as they ransacked the place, destroying everything her mother had worked so hard to build. When they finally left, laughing about teaching the neighborhood a lesson, Nana had crawled out to find her mother barely breathing. "I tried to wake her up," Nana whispered, her small voice cracking. "But she won't open her eyes. There's so much blood." The restaurant remained frozen in that moment. Han Do-sung's lieutenants exchanged glances, unsure how their boss would respond to this unprecedented interruption. Some of the other patrons had begun to whisper among themselves, clearly uncomfortable with the scene unfolding before them. One woman in an expensive fur coat actually stood up to leave, unable to handle the emotional weight of the moment. But Han Do-sung wasn't thinking about his reputation or his image. He wasn't calculating the business implications of getting involved in what was clearly gang violence on someone else's territory. For the first time in 30 years, Han Do-sung was thinking with his heart instead of his head. He looked down at Nana, this brave little girl who had somehow found the courage to burst into the most dangerous restaurant in Chicago and approach the most feared man in the room. She could have gone to the police, could have called an ambulance, could have run to neighbors or relatives. Instead, she had chosen him. A child's desperate instinct had led her straight to the one person who had the power and resources to actually make a difference. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Han Do-sung asked, his voice gentler than anyone in that room had ever heard it. "Nana," she managed between sobs. "Kim Nana." Han Do-sung nodded slowly, then looked up at his bodyguard, Tony Russo. "Get the car," he said quietly. "Now." Tony hesitated for just a moment. In all his years working for Han Do-sung, he had never seen his boss make a decision this impulsive, this emotional. "Boss, maybe we should—" I said, "Get the car." Han Do-sung's tone carried just enough steel to remind everyone that despite the unusual circumstances, he was still very much in charge. As Tony hurried toward the exit, Han Do-sung turned his attention back to Nana. With surprising gentleness for a man his size, he knelt down beside her chair so they were at eye level. His massive frame dwarfed the tiny girl, but somehow his presence seemed to comfort rather than intimidate her. "Nana, I need you to listen to me very carefully," Han Do-sung said, his voice steady and calm. "I'm going to help your mama, but first I need you to tell me exactly what these men looked like. Can you do that for me?" Nana nodded eagerly, relief flooding her features at the promise of help. Through her tears, she began to describe the attackers. Two women, both young, both wearing red bandanas. One had a scar running down her left cheek. The other had a spider tattoo on her neck. They had called each other by names, Seo Rin and Hua Yo. Han Do-sung's expression darkened as he listened. He recognized the descriptions immediately. Baek Seo Rin and Kang Hua Yo, mid-level enforcers for the Red Serpents, a gang that had been trying to muscle in on territory that had been neutral ground for over a decade. They were known for their brutality, their willingness to hurt innocent people to make their point. But what they had done tonight was different. What they had done tonight was personal. Han Do-sung stood up, his decision made. "Marco," he called to one of his lieutenants. "Call Dr. Chen. Tell him to meet us at General Hospital with everything he needs for emergency surgery. Tell him it's a priority case." Marco nodded and immediately pulled out his phone. Dr. Chen was one of the city's best trauma surgeons, and he owed Han Do-sung more favors than he could count. If anyone could save Nana's mother, it would be him. Sal, Han Do-sung continued, addressing another of his men. I want you to find Baek Seo-rin and Kang Hwa-yo. Bring them to the warehouse on 5th Street, alive. I want to have a conversation with them about their business practices. Sal smiled, a predatory grin that promised pain. Consider it done, boss. Han Do-seung looked around the restaurant one more time, taking in the shocked faces of his associates and the other patrons. He knew this moment would be talked about for years to come. The night Han Do-sung showed mercy. The night the ice-cold crime boss let a little girl melt his heart. But he didn't care about any of that anymore. All he cared about was the small hand that slipped into his as Nana looked up at him with complete trust. Is my mama going to be okay? She asked in a tiny voice. Han Do-sung squeezed her hand gently. I'm going to make sure she is, he promised. And Han Do-sung never made promises he couldn't keep. The ride to the flower shop took 12 minutes through the crowded Chicago streets. Han Do-sung sat in the back of his black sedan with Nana beside him, her small body finally relaxing for the first time in hours. She had stopped crying, though her eyes remained wide and watchful. Every few seconds she would look up at Han Do-sung as if making sure he was still there, still committed to helping her. Tony drove with the skill of a man who had navigated Chicago streets under pressure many times before. Behind them, 2 more cars followed. One carrying Dr. Chen and his medical equipment, the other filled with Han Do-sung's most trusted men. As they pulled up to the flower shop, Han Do-sung could see the devastation immediately. The front window had been smashed, flowers and plants lay scattered across the sidewalk, their petals crushed underfoot. The sign that had once proudly displayed Hyejin's flowers hung crooked and damaged. But Han Do-sung's attention was focused on what lay inside. Nana's grip tightened on Han Do-sung's hand as they stepped out of the car. The cold night air carried the scent of crushed roses and broken dreams. Through the shattered storefront they could see a figure lying motionless on the floor among scattered flower petals and overturned displays. Hyejin Martinez lay crumpled behind the counter, her dark hair fanned across the wooden floor like spilled ink. Blood pooled beneath her head, and her breathing came in shallow, irregular gasps. Han Do-sung had seen enough violence in his lifetime to know she was fading fast. Dr. Chen rushed past them, his medical bag already open. He knelt beside Hyejin, his practiced hands moving quickly to assess her injuries. Severe head trauma, he muttered, checking her pulse. Possible internal bleeding. We need to move her now. Han Do-sung watched as the doctor worked, but his attention was divided. Nana stood frozen in the doorway, her small frame trembling as she took in the destruction of everything she knew. Her home, her mother's life's work. All of it lay in ruins around them. Nana, listen to me, Han Do-sung said, crouching down to meet her eyes. The doctor is going to take care of your mama, but I need you to stay strong for her, okay? The little girl nodded, though tears continued to stream down her cheeks. Will she remember me when she wakes up? The question hit Han Do-sung harder than any bullet ever had. He thought of Maria, of all the things left unsaid, all the moments stolen by violence. She'll remember, he said firmly, and she'll be so proud of how brave you were tonight. As the paramedics loaded Hyejin onto a stretcher, Han Do-sung's phone buzzed. Sal's voice came through, crisp and efficient. Boss, we found them. Seo-rin and Hwa-yo were at a bar on Ashland, bragging about their work tonight. They're secured at the warehouse. Han Do-sung's jaw tightened. The rage that had been simmering beneath his protective instincts began to surface. These weren't just random criminals anymore. They were the women who had put a 7-year-old girl through hell. They were the reason Hyejin might never see another sunrise. Good, Han Do-sung replied, his voice deadly calm. I'll be there after I get Nana settled. The ride to the hospital passed in a blur of sirens and Nana's whispered prayers. Han Do-sung found himself holding the little girl's hand as she spoke to her unconscious mother, telling her about the nice man who was going to help them, promising to be good if she would just wake up. At the hospital, Dr. Chen disappeared into surgery while Han Do-sung made arrangements. Nana would stay in a private room adjacent to her mother's, round-the-clock security, the best pediatric care available. Money was no object when it came to keeping this child safe. But as Han Do-sung tucked Nana into the hospital bed, he knew his night was far from over. The little girl had fallen asleep clutching a stuffed bear one of the nurses had brought her, exhaustion finally claiming her small body. She looked so peaceful, so innocent, so different from the broken child who had stumbled into his restaurant hours earlier. Han Do-sung stepped into the hallway and pulled out his phone. "Tony, bring the car around. It's time to visit our guests." The warehouse on 5th Street was one of Han Do-sung's more discreet properties. No neighbors to hear sounds, no windows for light to escape. Just thick concrete walls and the kind of privacy that allowed for serious conversations. Baek Seo-rin and Kang Hwa-yo sat tied to chairs in the center of the empty space. Their earlier bravado had been replaced by the kind of fear that came with recognizing your situation had gone from bad to catastrophic. Both women were young, maybe mid-20s, with the kind of swagger that came from thinking violence made you untouchable. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Han Do-sung entered the warehouse slowly, his footsteps echoing in the vast space. He had changed from his dinner suit into darker clothes, but his presence filled the room just as completely. Behind him, Tony and Sal took positions by the door. "Ladies," Han Do-sung said, his voice conversational. "I understand you had a busy evening." Seo-rin, the one with the scar, tried to maintain her defiance. "Look, man, whatever this is about, we can work something out. You know how it is in our business." Han Do-sung walked a slow circle around the two chairs, studying his captives like specimens under a microscope. "Our business," he repeated. "Tell me, Seo-rin, what business do you think beating unconscious mothers in front of their children falls under?" The color drained from Seo-rin's face. Hwa-yo, the one with the spider tattoo, began to sweat visibly. They were starting to understand that this wasn't about territory or money or any of the usual reasons people in their line of work found themselves in situations like this. "The woman was holding out on us," Hwa-yo stammered. "She owed protection money. We had to make an example." Han Do-sung stopped walking. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "An example?" he said softly. "What example did you think you were making when you traumatized a 7-year-old girl?" Neither woman answered. They couldn't, because there was no answer that would save them now. Han Do-sung reached into his jacket and pulled out a photograph. It was a picture Nana had drawn while waiting at the hospital, a crayon sketch of her mother surrounded by flowers. The little girl had given it to him, asking him to keep it safe until her mama could see it. "This is Kim Na-na," Han Do-sung said, holding up the drawing. 7 years old. Loves butterflies and chocolate ice cream. Dreams of becoming a teacher so she can help other children learn to read. Tonight, she watched 2 grown women beat her mother unconscious over $67. He set the drawing on a nearby table where both women could see it. $67, he repeated. That's what Hyejin had in her register. Barely enough to cover tomorrow's grocery run. And you two thought it was worth putting a child through hell to take it. Seo-rin made one last desperate attempt at negotiation. "Look, Mr. Han, we didn't know the kid was there. If we had known..." "If you had known what?" Han Do-sung's voice cut through the excuse like a blade. "If you had known, you would have beaten her too? Made sure there were no witnesses to your heroic victory over a single mother trying to make an honest living?" Han Do-sung walked to the table where his men had laid out various tools, not weapons exactly, but implements that could become very persuasive in the right hands. He selected a pair of heavy pliers, testing their grip thoughtfully. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his tone remaining conversational despite the deadly intent behind his words. "You're going to tell me exactly how much money your little gang has made from terrorizing shop owners in Hyejin's neighborhood. Every dollar. Every cent. And then, you're going to help me figure out how to make sure it gets distributed back to the people you've been bleeding dry. Huayo's voice cracked as she spoke. We don't have that kind of authority. The money goes up the chain. We just collect. Han Do-sung nodded as if this was exactly what he'd expected to hear. Then it sounds like I need to have a conversation with your boss as well. What's her name? Choi Eun-rok, Seorin whispered. But you can't touch her. She's got connections. Protection. Han Do-sung actually smiled at this, though there was no warmth in the expression. Protection? He mused. You mean like the protection you offered Hyejin? The kind that involves unconscious mothers and traumatized children? He set the pliers back on the table and picked up his phone instead. Tony, I want you to arrange a meeting with this Choi Eun-rok. Tonight, if possible. Let her know that Han Do-sung would like to discuss her organization's customer service practices. As Tony made the call, Han Do-sung turned back to his captives. You see, ladies, I've been in this business for a very long time. I've made my share of enemies, taken my share of territory, collected my share of debts. But there are lines, even people like us don't cross. And tonight, you crossed every single one of them. The warehouse fell silent except for the sound of Huayo quietly sobbing. Seorin stared at the little girl's drawing on the table, perhaps finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what they had done. Han Do-sung's phone rang. It was Dr. Chen calling from the hospital. How is she? Han Do-sung answered immediately. Touch and go, the doctor replied. The next few hours will be critical, but she's a fighter. The surgery went better than expected. Han Do-sung felt a weight lift from his chest that he hadn't even realized was there, and Nana, sleeping peacefully. She asked the nurses to tell you thank you for keeping your promise. After ending the call, Han Do-sung looked at Seorin and Huayo with something approaching pity. Hyejin is going to live, he told them, which means you two just graduated from attempted murder to aggravated assault. Congratulations. He walked toward the door, then paused and looked back. I want you to think very carefully about the choices you've made tonight. About the little girl who will have nightmares for months because of your actions. About the woman who will never feel completely safe in her own shop again. And then, I want you to think about what kind of people you want to be when this is all over. Han Do-sung left them there to contemplate their situation while he went to prepare for his meeting with Choi Eun-rok. The night was far from finished. But something fundamental had shifted in Han Do-sung's world. For the first time in 30 years, he was fighting for something more than territory or respect or fear. He was fighting for the same thing that 7-year-old girl had fought for when she burst into his restaurant and grabbed his sleeve. He was fighting for family. The meeting with Choi Eun-rok was set for 2 a.m. at an abandoned auto shop on the industrial side of town. Han Do-sung arrived with Tony and 3 other men, their black sedans cutting through the empty streets like shadows against the flickering streetlights. The air was thick with the scent of motor oil and rust, a fitting backdrop for the kind of conversation that was about to unfold. Eun-rok had brought her own crew, 6 people who tried to look intimidating but couldn't quite hide the nervousness in their eyes when Han Do-sung stepped out of his car. Word traveled fast in their world, and by now everyone knew that Han Do-sung had personally involved himself in what should have been a minor neighborhood dispute. Choi Eun-rok was younger than Han Do-sung had expected, maybe 35, with gold jewelry and enough designer clothes to stock a small boutique. She carried herself with the kind of artificial confidence that came from never having faced real consequences for her actions. Han Do-sung recognized the type immediately. All flash, no substance, the kind of leader who sent others to do her dirty work while she counted money and made threats from a safe distance. Mr. Han, Eun-rok said, extending a hand that Han Do-sung ignored entirely. This is unexpected. I heard you don't usually get involved in street-level business anymore. Han Do-sung's silence stretched long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. He studied Unrak with the same intensity he might use to examine a particularly venomous snake, cataloging weaknesses, measuring threats, calculating exactly how much pressure it would take to break this woman's carefully constructed image. Street-level business, Hando Sung repeated finally, his voice carrying across the empty garage like distant thunder. Is that what you call terrorizing mothers and traumatizing children? Yunrak's smile faltered slightly, but she tried to maintain her swagger. Look, business is business. Sometimes people need reminders about their obligations. My girls might have gotten a little carried away, but your girls, Hando Sung interrupted, put a 7-year-old girl through hell tonight. They beat her mother unconscious over $67. $67, Choi. The temperature in the garage seemed to drop. Hando Sung's men had positioned themselves strategically around the space, and Yunrak's crew was beginning to realize that this meeting might not end with the usual handshake and territorial agreement they had expected. The woman was behind on her payments, Yunrak said, her voice losing some of its earlier confidence. 3 months behind. We gave her plenty of warnings. Hando Sung took a step closer, and despite being surrounded by her own people, Yunrak instinctively backed away. There was something in Hando Sung's eyes that spoke of violence older and deeper than anything Unrak had ever encountered. A kind of controlled fury that made the young gang leader's petty brutalities look like children playing at being monsters. 3 months, Hando Sung said thoughtfully. Tell me, Choi, do you know what Hyejin does for a living? She runs some flower shop, Yunrak replied, confusion evident in her voice. She runs a flower shop that barely makes enough to cover rent and groceries. She works 16-hour days arranging bouquets for weddings she'll never afford to have, funeral wreaths for people she's never met, Valentine's arrangements for lovers who have what she lost when her husband died in a construction accident 3 years ago. Hando Sung's voice remained steady, but there was something building beneath the calm surface, like pressure in a boiler that was approaching its breaking point. She's been behind on your blood money because she spent her last savings on medicine for Nana when the girl had pneumonia last winter. She chose her daughter's life over your protection racket. And somehow you thought that made her fair game for your animals. Yunrak tried to interrupt, but Hando Sung continued as if she hadn't spoken. Do you know what that little girl did tonight, Choi? After she watched your people beat her mother unconscious, after she saw everything she knew destroyed, she didn't call the police. She didn't run to neighbors. She walked 12 blocks through the worst part of the city. A 7-year-old girl, alone in the dark, to find someone who could help. Hando Sung pulled out Nana's crayon drawing again, holding it up so everyone in the garage could see it. This is what courage looks like, Choi. This is what real strength is. A child who refuses to give up on the person she loves most in the world. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Unrak's crew seemed uncomfortable now, shifting from foot to foot, avoiding eye contact. Hando Sung folded the drawing carefully and placed it back in his jacket, right over his heart. So here's what's going to happen, Hando Sung said, his tone shifting from philosophical to purely business. You're going to liquidate your entire operation in Hyejin's neighborhood. Every protection payment, every debt, every outstanding balance, it all disappears tonight. Yunrak's artificial bravado flared back to life. You can't just come in here and... I'm not done talking, Hando Sung said quietly, and the younger woman's mouth snapped shut. You're going to take whatever money you've collected from that neighborhood over the past year, and you're going to distribute it back to every shop owner, every family, every person you've been bleeding dry. That's impossible. We don't have that kind of cash on hand. And even if we did, then you'll find it, Hando Sung replied. Sell your cars, your jewelry, your mother's china if you have to. Rob your own dealers for all I care. But those people are getting their money back. Hando Sung walked closer until he was standing directly in front of Yunrak, close enough that the younger woman had to crane her neck to maintain eye contact. And if I hear about any of your people operating within 10 blocks of Hyejin's flower shop ever again, if so much as one of your crew jaywalks in her neighborhood, I will personally introduce you to the kind of consequences your parents should have taught you about years ago. Yunrak swallowed hard, all pretense of confidence gone. You're serious about this? Deadly serious, Han Do-seung confirmed. You have 48 hours to make this right. After that, every hour that passes without full restitution will cost you something you value. And Choi? I'm very creative when it comes to collecting debts. He turned to leave, then stopped one more time. Oh, and one more thing. Seorin and Hwayo, they're done working for you. In fact, they're done working in this city altogether. I'm sending them to a rehabilitation program on the West Coast where they can think about their life choices. If they ever come back to Chicago, well, let's just say they won't enjoy the welcome party. With that, Han Do-seung walked out of the garage and into the cold Chicago night. Behind him, he could hear Yunrak's crew already beginning to argue about how they were going to come up with the money. But that wasn't his problem anymore. His problem was getting back to the hospital to check on a little girl who had somehow managed to crack open his heart. 6 months later, the transformation was complete. Hyejin stood behind the counter of her rebuilt flower shop, watching through sparkling new windows as her daughter Nana played in the small garden Han Do-seung had installed behind the building. The shop looked better than it ever had. New fixtures, fresh paint, a state-of-the-art security system that was probably overkill for a flower shop, but gave Hyejin peace of mind. The red serpents had vanished from the neighborhood entirely, their former territories now under the quiet protection of men who understood the difference between power and bullying. Shop owners who had spent years living in fear now went about their business without looking over their shoulders. Children played in the streets again without their parents worrying about them getting caught in crossfire. And every Tuesday, like clockwork, Han Do-seung would arrive. He always came in the early evening, after the rush of customers had died down, but before Hyejin started closing up for the night. He would park his black sedan in front of the shop, and Nana would run to greet him with a drawing or a story about something that had happened at school that week. Today was no different. Nana burst through the door from the garden, her hands covered in dirt from planting new tulip bulbs. Mr. Han, look what I made. She held up a flower crown she had woven from daisies and baby's breath. It was slightly lopsided, but the pride on her face made it perfect. Han Do-seung knelt down so she could place it on his head, this feared crime boss who had built an empire on violence and intimidation, now wearing a crown of flowers made by a 7-year-old girl. That's beautiful, Nana. You're getting better at this every week. Mama's teaching me, Nana said, beaming. She says I have natural talent. Hyejin emerged from the back room with fresh coffee, the ritual they had established over the past months. She still walked with a slight limp from her injuries, a permanent reminder of that terrible night, but her smile was genuine and warm. You're spoiling her, you know, Hyejin said, though there was no real complaint in her voice. Someone has to, Han Do-seung replied, accepting the coffee with a nod of thanks. They settled into the comfortable rhythm they had developed, Nana chattering about school, while Han Do-seung listened with an attention he had never given anyone before. Hyejin worked on a wedding arrangement, occasionally adding her own observations to the conversation. To anyone watching from outside, they looked like a family. And maybe, in some unconventional way, that's exactly what they had become. Later, after Nana had been sent upstairs to start her homework, Hyejin and Han Do-seung sat together in the quiet shop, surrounded by the scent of roses and lilies. I got a letter today, Hyejin said, pulling an envelope from her apron pocket. From Choi Yun-rak. She's leaving Chicago, moving to Seattle apparently, to start over. Han Do-seung raised an eyebrow. Starting over as what? A legitimate businesswoman, would you believe it? Hyejin laughed softly. She's opening a restaurant. Said she wanted to thank me for, and I quote, helping her see the error of her ways. Han Do-seung smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. Sometimes people just need the right motivation to change. Is that what happened to you? Hyejin asked, her voice gentle. Did Nana motivate you to change? Han Do-sung was quiet for a long moment, staring at his coffee cup as if it held the answers to questions he hadn't known how to ask. I haven't changed, he said finally. I'm still the same man I was 6 months ago. I still run the same business, still make the same hard decisions. But? Hyejin prompted. But that night, when Nana grabbed my sleeve and looked up at me with those eyes full of hope and fear, I remembered something I'd forgotten a long time ago. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I remembered what it felt like to care about something more than survival. To want to protect someone not because it was profitable or strategic, but because it was right. Hyejin reached across the table and squeezed his hand. She saved you, didn't she? My brave little girl saved the most dangerous man in Chicago. Han Do-sung looked up, and for the first time in 30 years there were tears in his eyes. No, he said softly. She reminded me that I was worth saving. Upstairs, they could hear Nana singing to herself as she worked on her homework, her voice carrying through the floorboards like a blessing. The city outside continued its eternal dance of light and shadow, danger and hope, but inside Hyejin's flower shop, there was only peace. The city still whispered about the night Han Do-sung saved a child and found his soul. The story had taken on a life of its own, growing and changing with each retelling. Some versions had him single-handedly dismantling the entire Red Serpents organization. Others claimed he had donated millions to charities for abused women and children. The truth was both simpler and more profound than any of the rumors. Han Do-sung was still a crime boss. He still ran his empire with an iron fist. He still made decisions that would horrify ordinary citizens. But now, there were lines he wouldn't cross. Rules that governed what kinds of businesses he would and wouldn't tolerate in his territories. And God help anyone who threatened a child or an innocent mother trying to make an honest living. But Nana knew the truth that the adults had missed entirely. She hadn't saved her mother by finding the most dangerous man in Chicago. She had saved him by showing him that even the hardest heart could choose love over fear. One evening, as Han Do-sung was preparing to leave the flower shop, Nana ran up to him with a serious expression on her face. Mr. Han, I have a question. Of course. What is it? Why did you help us? Nana asked, her brown eyes searching his face. Everyone says you're a bad man who does bad things. But you were nice to me and Mama? Why? Han Do-sung knelt down so they were eye to eye, just like that first night in the restaurant. Because a very brave little girl reminded me that being strong doesn't mean being cruel. And that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is choose to be kind. Nana thought about this for a moment, then threw her arms around his neck in a fierce hug. I'm glad I found you. Han Do-sung hugged her back, this child who had somehow become the daughter he had never had. I'm glad you found me too, sweetheart. As he drove away that night, Han Do-sung glanced in his rearview mirror and saw Nana waving from the window, her smile bright enough to light up the darkest corners of the city. And for the first time in 3 decades, Han Do-sung felt something he thought had died with Maria all those years ago. He felt hope. Sometimes the smallest hands carry the greatest power to change everything. Sometimes a child's courage can crack open the hardest heart. And sometimes, in the darkest corners of the most dangerous cities, a little girl in a blood-stained dress can find the one person who has both the power and the will to make things right. Han Do-sung never forgot the night Kim Na-na burst into his restaurant and changed his life forever. And he never forgot the promise he made to himself that night, to be worthy of the trust that innocent child had placed in him. The world didn't change overnight. Crime didn't disappear from Chicago's streets. But in one small neighborhood on the South Side, in one flower shop run by a brave mother and her even braver daughter, there was light where there had been darkness. There was hope where there had been despair. And there was family where there had been only fear. And sometimes, that's all the change the world needs.